The summer of 2009 burned hot in Los Angeles, but nothing compared to the pressure building inside the rented mansion on North Carolwood Drive. Michael Jackson moved through the halls like a ghost in his own home, his thin frame casting shadows that seemed too large for his body. The king of pop was preparing for his comeback 50 concert that would either resurrect his career or bury it forever. Nobody knew then that only one burial was coming. Inside those walls, a different story was unfolding than the world imagined. Michael wasn't just rehearsing dance moves and vocal runs. He was fighting a war against invisible enemies that had haunted him for decades. Sleep had become his greatest adversary, a battle he lost every single night. His personal physician, Dr. Conrad Murray, arrived each evening with promises of rest, carrying a medical bag that held secrets nobody would fully understand until it was far too late. The household staff noticed everything but said nothing. They watched Michael stumble through the hallways at 3 a.m, his eyes wide and desperate. They heard him pleading for sleep, begging for just a few hours apiece. The children, Prince, Paris, and Blanket, were kept carefully away from their father's struggles, sheltered in their own wing of the mansion. Michael wanted them to remember him as strong, as magical, as a father who could do anything. He never wanted them to see him like this, broken and afraid. His manager and the concert promoters called constantly, demanding more rehearsal time, better performances, stronger commitment. They had invested millions in the comeback tour, and Michael was the only asset that mattered. They didn't see a fragile man approaching the edge of collapse. They saw a product, a brand, a money machine that needed to start working again. The pressure crushed down on him from every direction, and there was nowhere left to run. On June 24th, Michael went to rehearsal at the Staples Center one last time. Video footage from that night shows him dancing, spinning, moving with a grace that made him legendary. His voice soared through Earth's song with power that seemed impossible for someone so physically depleted. The crew applauded, the director smiled, and everyone agreed that Michael was finally ready. They had no idea they were watching a man use his very last reserves of strength, burning through whatever remained of his life force for one final performance. He returned home after midnight, exhausted beyond anything sleep could fix. Dr. Murray was waiting, as always, with his promises and his 4 drips. Michael trusted him completely. After all, Murray was being paid $150,000 a month to keep the king of pop functioning. That kind of money bought loyalty, or so Michael believed. What it actually bought was complicity in a tragedy that would shock the entire world within hours. The bedroom on the 2nd floor became a makeshift hospital room that night. Medical equipment lined the walls, monitors beeped softly, and 4 stands cast strange shadows in the dim light. Michael lay down, hoping desperately for the rest that always escaped him. Murray prepared the medications, the same dangerous combination he had been administering for weeks. Propofol, the powerful anesthetic that Michael called his milk, flowed into his veins. It was meant for surgical procedures, not insomnia, but desperation makes people do unthinkable things. As dawn approached on June 25th, something went terribly wrong. The monitors stopped their rhythmic beeping. Michael's breathing became shallow, then stopped entirely. Dr. Murray, who had left the room to make phone calls, returned to find his patient in crisis. Panic consumed him as he realized the magnitude of what was happening. He called for help too late, performed CPR incorrectly, and made decisions that would haunt him forever. By the time paramedics arrived, the king of pop was already gone, his heart silent, his legend about to explode into something even larger than his life had ever been. The news broke just after 2 in the afternoon. Michael Jackson was dead at 50 years old. The announcement hit the world like a meteor strike, obliterating everything else in the news cycle. Fans collapsed in the streets. Radio stations played his music nonstop, and the internet nearly crashed from the traffic surge. But while the public mourned, a much darker machinery began working behind closed doors, a machinery designed to hide truths that powerful people wanted buried alongside Michael's body. Within hours of his death, the mansion on Carolwood Drive transformed into a crime scene. Investigators swarmed through the rooms, photographing everything, bagging evidence, documenting the final chapter of an extraordinary life. They found medical equipment that belonged in a hospital, not a bedroom. They discovered enough pharmaceutical drugs to stock a small pharmacy, prescriptions written under fake names, bottles with labels that didn't match the contents. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that Michael's death wasn't a simple tragedy. It was the inevitable conclusion of a long, twisted story. Dr. Conrad Murray disappeared from the mansion before the police arrived in force. He would later claim he tried to save Michael, that he did everything possible, but the evidence told a different story. Phone records showed he was texting and calling his girlfriends while Michael lay dying. The propofol dosage was far beyond safe limits. He had no proper monitoring equipment, no emergency backup plans, no reversal medications ready. He was essentially experimenting on one of the most famous people on Earth, and when the experiment failed, he panicked like an amateur. But Murray was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. As investigators dug deeper, they found a network of doctors who had been prescribing dangerous medications to Michael for years. Some used aliases to hide their famous patient's identity. Dr. Arnold Klein had been giving Michael powerful injections of Demerol for years, sometimes multiple times a week. Other physicians provided Xanax, Valium, Ativan, medications that should never be mixed, especially not with propofol. Each doctor claimed they didn't know about the others, but that ignorance was either willful or criminally negligent. The concert promoters, AEG-Liv, had their own secrets to protect. Internal emails emerged showing they knew Michael was struggling. They had discussed his weight loss, his confusion, his inability to maintain rehearsal schedules. Yet they pushed forward anyway, too invested in the financial success of the comeback tour to stop and address the human cost. They had hired Dr. Murray themselves, making him dependent on their paycheck rather than his patient's well-being. It was a catastrophic conflict of interest that put profit above a person's life. Michael's family watched helplessly as the truth slowly emerged, each revelation more painful than the last. His mother, Catherine, couldn't understand how her son had been surrounded by so many people yet died alone. His siblings struggled with guilt, wondering if they could have done more to save him. They knew Michael had struggled with pain medication for years, ever since the Pepsi commercial accident in 1984 left him with severe burns and chronic pain. They knew he suffered from insomnia and anxiety, but they never imagined it had escalated to propofol, to doctors shopping, to such dangerous desperation. The toxicology report, when it finally came, painted a devastating picture. Michael's blood contained lethal levels of propofol, along with traces of benzodiazepines and other sedatives. The coroner ruled it a homicide, meaning someone else's actions directly caused his death. Dr. Murray was arrested and charged with involuntary manslaughter, but many people believed he was just a scapegoat. The real guilt spread wider, touching everyone who enabled Michael's addiction, everyone who looked away, everyone who chose money and fame over human decency. As summer turned to fall, more secrets emerged from the shadows. Private investigators hired by the family uncovered hidden bank accounts, mysterious payments, and contracts with clauses that seemed designed to keep Michael working regardless of his health. They found evidence that some people close to Michael had been stealing from him for years, forging his signature, making deals behind his back. The man who had given so much to the world had been surrounded by vultures, people who saw him only as a resource to be exploited until there was nothing left to take. The moment Michael Jackson stopped breathing, a brutal war began for control of his legacy, his children, his fortune, and the truth itself. The battlefield was drawn across courtrooms, television studios, and the court of public opinion. Everyone claimed to represent Michael's true wishes, but most were simply fighting for power and profit. The man they all claimed to love had become a prize to be won. Katherine Jackson, Michael's 80-year-old mother, filed for guardianship of his 3 children within days of his death. She was granted temporary custody, but the battle was far from over. Debbie Rowe, the biological mother of Prince and Paris, suddenly emerged from years of silence, initially demanding her parental rights before eventually backing away from a custody fight. Nobody mentioned Blanket's biological mother, a mystery that remains unsolved to this day. The children, traumatized and confused, found themselves at the center of adult conflicts they shouldn't have had to witness. Meanwhile, the executors of Michael's estate, John Branca and John McClane, took control of his business affairs. They discovered Michael had died deeply in debt, owing more than $400 million to various creditors. The Neverland Ranch was in foreclosure. He had taken out massive loans using his music catalog as collateral, and bills were piling up faster than anyone could count. The estate was essentially bankrupt, a shocking revelation given Michael's legendary earning power during his lifetime. But Branca and McLean saw potential where others saw ruin. They immediately began exploiting Michael's catalog, negotiating deals, and planning projects that would transform the dead superstar into the highest-earning deceased celebrity in history. Within weeks, they negotiated a deal with AEG for a concert documentary using footage from Michael's final rehearsals. This is it would gross more than $260 million worldwide, the highest-grossing concert documentary ever made. Death, it turned out, was very profitable for the Michael Jackson brand. Some family members, particularly Michael's father Joe and several siblings, challenged the estate's control. They claimed Branca had been fired by Michael years earlier, that the will was fraudulent, that they should have control instead. They filed lawsuits, held press conferences, and made accusations that kept Michael's name in the headlines but did nothing to honor his memory. The fighting became so bitter that some siblings stopped speaking to each other entirely, the family fracturing under the weight of grief and greed. The custody battle took a darker turn when questions arose about Catherine's ability to care for 3 young children at her age. Michael's siblings began circling, each suggesting there would be better guardians. Some genuinely loved the children and wanted to protect them. Others saw an opportunity to gain influence over the estate through the kids. The children themselves, especially Paris, began showing signs of severe trauma, struggling with depression and the overwhelming reality that their father was never coming home. As the first anniversary of Michael's death approached, the family remained at war with itself and with the estate executors. Catherine was barely speaking to some of her own children. Joe was effectively cut out of decisions regarding his grandchildren. The siblings were divided into factions, some supporting the estate, others fighting it at every turn. And through it all, the children watched and learned that the adult world was cruel, that family could turn on each other, that death solved nothing and sometimes made everything worse. The trial of Dr. Conrad Murray, scheduled to begin in 2 years, loomed over everything. It would force everyone to relive Michael's final days, to hear devastating testimony, to see evidence that no one wanted to face. The prosecution promised justice. But what did justice mean when Michael was still dead? When his children were still orphaned? When the machine that killed him was still operating, ready to chew up the next desperate superstar who needed help and found exploitation instead? The war for Michael's legacy wasn't about honor or memory or love. It was about money, power, and control. It was about who got to tell his story, who got to profit from his name, who got to decide what the world remembered. Michael had spent his entire life trying to control his own narrative, fighting tabloids and critics and people who wanted to destroy him. In death, he lost that final battle. His legacy became whatever the loudest voices claimed it to be, truth and lies blending together until no one could tell the difference anymore. Paris Jackson was 11 years old when she stood at her father's memorial service, her small voice shaking as she told the world that Michael had been the best father anyone could imagine. That moment broke hearts across the globe, but it also marked the beginning of a long journey through trauma, truth, and the desperate search for who she really was without her father's protecting presence. Growing up behind masks and veils had been normal for Paris, Prince, and Blanket. Michael kept their faces hidden from the public, creating a barrier between his children and the world that had treated him so cruelly. But with his death, that protection vanished instantly. Their faces were everywhere, photographed constantly, their grief packaged and sold to millions. Privacy became an impossible dream. Normal childhood became a fantasy. They were Michael Jackson's kids now, not just kids. Catherine did her best, but raising 3 traumatized children in her late 70s proved overwhelming. The kids lived at a family compound in Encino, surrounded by aunts, uncles, and cousins who all had opinions about how they should be raised. Some family members respected Michael's wishes to keep the children grounded and out of the spotlight. Others saw opportunities, suggesting the kids could capitalize on their famous name, maybe start performing, definitely start making money. The children heard all of it, understanding far more than the adults realized. Prince, the oldest, tried to be strong for his siblings. He threw himself into school, sports, and keeping his head down. He rarely spoke about his father publicly, preferring to process his grief privately. But Paris struggled much more openly. She began acting out, questioning everything, pushing boundaries that Catherine didn't know how to enforce. The depression that would nearly kill her years later was already taking root, fed by unanswered questions and unbearable loss. As Paris entered her teenage years, she started searching for truth about her father's death. She didn't believe the official story, didn't trust that justice had been served when Dr. Murray received only 2 years for involuntary manslaughter. She talked to people who had been around her father, read everything she could find, and began forming her own theories about what really happened. Some of what she learned helped her understand her father better. Other discoveries devastated her, particularly learning about the people who had used and betrayed him. The internet became both Paris's salvation and her destruction. She connected with other fans, people who loved her father and wanted to preserve his legacy. But she also encountered the dark side of fame, the conspiracy theorists, the haters, the people who said terrible things about Michael and about her. The cyberbullying grew so intense that Paris struggled to separate truth from lies, reality from cruel fiction. Her mental health deteriorated rapidly, and the family seemed unable or unwilling to get her the help she desperately needed. In 2013, Paris attempted suicide. The news shocked everyone who had watched her grow up in the public eye. She was rushed to the hospital, survived, and spent time in treatment facilities working through trauma that had been building for years. The attempt forced conversations a family had been avoiding about mental health, about the cost of fame, about what Michael's children needed that they weren't getting. Paris later described feeling like she had no control over her own life, no say in her own future, no escape from being Michael Jackson's daughter instead of just Paris. After treatment, Paris began speaking more openly about her father and her own struggles. She gave interviews where she shared memories of Michael, describing a playful, loving parent who cooked with him, played with him, and tried to give them as normal a childhood as possible under impossible circumstances. She talked about his sense of humor, his creativity, his deep love for his children. She wanted the world to know him as she had known him, not as the tabloid creation or the tragic figure, but as a dad. But Paris also began dropping hints about darker truths she believed the public didn't know. She suggested in interviews that her father's death wasn't an accident or simple medical negligence. She believed he was murdered, that powerful people wanted him dead because of debts, business conflicts, or secrets he knew. She never named names directly, always careful to avoid lawsuits, but her implications were clear. Someone, somewhere, had wanted Michael Jackson dead, and they got their wish. Prince eventually joined his sister in speaking out, though more cautiously. He started a YouTube channel discussing his father's legacy, working to preserve the positive aspect of Michael's impact on music, charity, and culture. He announced plans to continue his father's humanitarian work, establishing foundations and supporting causes Michael had cared about. Unlike Paris's confrontational approach, Prince chose diplomacy, trying to build bridges and create positive change rather than seeking revenge or justice of perceived wrongs. Blanket, the youngest and most private, largely stayed out of the spotlight. He changed his name to Bye Guy as he got older, trying to establish his own identity separate from his famous father. He rarely gave interviews and avoided social media, perhaps learning from his siblings' painful public experiences. But those close to the family said Bye Guy struggled with his father's death in his own quiet way, never quite understanding why his dad had to leave when he was only 7 years old. As the 15th anniversary of Michael's death approached, the children had grown into young adults, each processing their father's legacy differently. They had survived the chaos, the family wars, the public scrutiny, and their own inner demons. They had learned that truth was complicated, that their father was both the magical parent they remembered and a troubled man who made mistakes. They were learning to live with both versions, honoring the father they loved while acknowledging the human being who struggled and suffered and ultimately lost his battle to survive in a world that demanded too much. 15 years after Michael Jackson's death, new evidence finally began emerging that painted a clearer, more disturbing picture of his final years. Private investigators, journalists, and former insiders started sharing information they had kept quiet, whether from fear, legal threats, or loyalty to people who no longer deserve protection. The truth had been buried, but graves don't keep secrets forever. A forensic accountant who had worked on the estate case came forward with documentation showing that Michael had been essentially held hostage by his own debt. The loans against his music catalog weren't just financial instruments. They were chains that kept him dependent on people who didn't have his best interests at heart. He couldn't retire, couldn't slow down, couldn't choose his own path because creditors owned him. The 50-concert commitment wasn't Michael's dream comeback. It was a condition of his financial survival, forced upon him by people who needed him performing whether he was physically capable or not. Medical experts who reviewed the evidence from Michael's death released detailed analyses showing just how compromised his health had been in his final months. He was severely underweight, showing signs of malnutrition and chronic stress. His body was riddled with the effects of decades of prescription drug use, his organs struggling to function properly. Multiple doctors had noted concerns in their private files but continued prescribing dangerous medications anyway. The propofol that killed him was just a final insult to a body that had been slowly shutting down for months. Former security personnel and household staff, no longer bound by confidentiality agreements, began sharing their observations. They described a man who was kind, generous, and loving with his children, but increasingly paranoid and isolated from everyone else. Michael frequently talked about people trying to control him, steal from him, or destroy him. The staff had dismissed these concerns as paranoia, but now some wondered if Michael had been right. Had he known people were plotting against him? Had he tried to fight back but found himself too weak, too isolated, too trapped? A whistleblower from AEG Live leaked internal emails that hadn't been made public during the earlier lawsuits. These communications showed executives discussing Michael's deteriorating health with cold calculation, weighing the financial risk of canceling the tour against the risk of something terrible happening. They had insurance policies to protect themselves if Michael died, which meant his death wouldn't cost them anything while his survival was essential to recoup their investment. The emails revealed a level of callousness that shocked even people familiar with the entertainment industry's brutal economics. Music industry veterans began speaking about the broader pattern of exploitation that Michael's death represented. They explained how artists, especially those who starred as children, are systematically controlled through debt, contracts, and dependency. Michael wasn't an isolated case. He was just the most famous victim of a system designed to extract maximum value from talent while providing minimum protection or support. His addiction issues, his financial troubles, his tragic death, all of it was predictable, perhaps even inevitable, given the machinery surrounding him. Paris Jackson used the 15-year anniversary to make her most direct statements yet. In a documentary interview, she stated plainly that she believed her father was murdered, not by Conrad Murray alone, but by a conspiracy of people who benefited from his death. She acknowledged she couldn't prove it in court, that her evidence was circumstantial and her sources were questionable. But she believed it in her heart, and she wanted the world to know that Michael's death wasn't just about one doctor's negligence. It was about an entire system that failed him, used him, and ultimately killed him. Legal experts who had followed the case closely weighed in on what justice might look like 15 years later. Dr. Murray had served his minimal sentence and been released, barred from practicing medicine but otherwise free. The civil lawsuit against AG had ended with a jury finding them not liable for Michael's death. No other doctors faced criminal charges despite their role in feeding Michael's addictions. The system had essentially declared that what happened to Michael was unfortunate, but not anyone's fault, an accident that couldn't have been prevented despite all the warning signs that everyone chose to ignore. New details emerged about Michael's final recordings, songs he had been working on before his death that contained lyrics suggesting he knew his time was running out. One unreleased track included lines about betrayal, about people waiting for him to fall, about fighting battles he couldn't win. Music industry insiders debated whether these were just artistic expressions or genuine cries for help. Some believed Michael was trying to tell the world what was happening to him, leaving clues in his music because he couldn't speak openly about the people controlling his life. The most devastating revelation came from a former advisor who finally broke their silence after 15 years. They explained that Michael had wanted to cancel the comeback concerts in his final weeks, that he had begged for postponement so he could recover his strength. But the contract had been structured to make cancellation financially catastrophic, potentially costing him everything including custody of his children through bankruptcy. He was trapped, forced to choose between his health and his family. He chose his family and kept performing until his body couldn't continue. The 50 concerts were supposed to be his salvation but became his death sentence. As the world marked 15 years since Michael Jackson's death, the truth that emerged was complicated, painful, and deeply troubling. He wasn't simply a tragic figure who struggled with addiction. He was a man systematically exploited by an industry that valued profit over human life. He was surrounded by people who claimed to love him but enabled his destruction. He was trapped in a financial and contractual web that left him no good options. He died not just from propofol, but from decades of being treated as a product rather than a person. The children, now adults, attended a private memorial service away from cameras. They had learned to live with the complicated truth of who their father was, a flawed genius, a loving parent, a victim of circumstances both of his own making and far beyond his control. They had survived the wars over his legacy and found their own paths forward. Paris became an activist and artist. Prince became a businessman and philanthropist. Baigai found peace and privacy. They carried their father's memory forward, not as a perfect saint, but as a real human being who loved them completely and tried his best in an impossible situation. The final truth about Michael Jackson's death is that there may never be complete truth. Too many people with too much to lose have kept their secrets. Too much time has passed, evidence has disappeared, and witnesses have died or become unreliable. What remains is a tragedy that didn't have to happen, a life that could have been saved if anyone with power had cared enough to try. Michael Jackson deserved better than the death he got. His children deserved their father. The world deserved more music, more artistry, more of the magic only he could create. Instead, we're left with 15 years of questions, anger, and the haunting knowledge that we watched it happen and did nothing to stop it until it was far too late to matter.